Okay, so I'm back in the code editor, located in lecture 55, which is located in Full Stack Course 5 examples folder. And this is our menu.html that is supposed to show us a list of menu categories together with the title of the whole menu with some dire warning about some kind of a white rice with brown rice substitution. Anyway, the point is, this is our menu categories page. This is all the categories. If we go to the browser, and I already started my browser sync, and I click on this menu, it now shows us all of these tiles as categories. Obviously, we're going to need more than the soups here. That means we're going to need to have some data. Somehow, we're going to need to pass some data into this menu.html. Once we get that data, we could now figure out how we could get that data into each one of these tiles that we're displaying for each category. Well, it sounds like we need a controller, not an implicit one, but an explicit controller to control this menu.html. Let's go back to public.routes.js and let's add the controller right here in our public.menu state. Let's put a comma here and we'll say controller. We'll call it a menu controller. And we'd like to use controller S syntax because that's the better practice. We'll call it menu CTRL, menu controller. And now obviously the controller by itself is not going to do anything for us. We actually need this controller to get some data from somewhere. And usually the way we get the data to the controller, if that controller needs the data to function already up front. In other words, if that controller doesn't even make sense to exist before the data shows up, we usually want to do that inside a resolve directly on our state. So let's go ahead and define a resolve, and we'll define it with the key menu categories because that's what we need. We need the menu categories. And the question is how we're going to get these menu categories. How are we going to get this data? Obviously, this data is the thing that lives on the server. It's not going to sit here on our client side, which means we're going to make an HTTP request, which means we need the $HTTP service. For that, it's better, instead of putting it inside of a controller somewhere, to put it in a separate service. So I'm going to go ahead and wire up the service, which I haven't created yet, but I should be able to create it right now. So first we'll call it menu service. That's where it's going to give us all the menu related data. And now I'm just using an inline notation to safeguard it from minification. And again, here we're going to inject this menu service. And what we need to return here is we need to return something from that menu service. Dot what? I guess at this point it should be dot get categories, right? Okay, so we need all of the categories to be returned. Okay, so if I save that right now, not much is going to happen other than possibly some errors because we don't really have the menu service even defined. So let's go ahead and define it. The thing is, where should we define it? Should we define it in public or should we define it in common? And I think we need to define it in common simply because when we go to the admin portion of this website, we're still going to need the categories, we're still going to need all the data, so we might as well just centralize it. So let's go to the common and we'll just right inside the common create a new file. We'll call it menu.service.js. Okay, so let's quickly write at least the first method that we need for it, which is the method of get categories. The first thing we need to do is create a quick iffy here, and there we go. We'll say that we want to be safeguarded from all kinds of errors, so we'll say use strict. And then we'll go ahead and define our menu service on the module common. So we'll say angular.module, we'll call up module common, we'll retrieve that, and we'll define a service, and we'll call it service menu service. Menu service is going to be the name of the function that actually defines it. And let's go ahead and inject a couple of things into it. We're definitely going to need the HTTP service to be injected in here, but we might want to inject something else. Let's just go ahead and type this up real quick. And we'll say function, menu service, and here we need HTTP. And as usual, we'll just say var service equals this. And the first method we want is service.get menu categories. Okay, actually, we probably named it something. We named it get categories, so let's keep that the same. Get categories, not menu categories. Okay, so in here, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to return whatever it is that's returned from our $HTTP service. And we're going to get some path here. I don't remember which one it is yet, but right now I'll just say then. We'll close that with a semicolon. And here we need a function. Don't need the name. And the function is going to have some response. And we'll need to return from that function, because that's a promise, we need to return response.data, because the actual data always exists on the data property of the response. Now, what do we put in here exactly? Well, we put the URL of our REST endpoint that was created for us by our restaurant server. So it's going to be something like /categories.json, and I already know this because I looked this up before. That's the endpoint. The thing is, though, we need the front part of this endpoint. We need the HTTP : and so on and so forth. Now, I could just hard code this URL right here, but it strikes me that that would be a bad idea, because we're going to have other methods that are going to use the same thing. Instead, it's probably better to define a constant in our common module and then reuse this constant everywhere. So let's go back to the common module.js, and let's define a constant here. And we'll call that constant API path. And the question is, what is our API path? Well, our API path is that restaurant server that we deployed for ourselves in one of the previous lectures. And as if you remember, I deployed mine with the subdomain of my username -course5.heroku.app.com. And we probably need to make it HTTPS, because GitHub is going to be using HTTPS to deploy it. So if we're going to make a request with just HTTP, Chrome and other browsers will probably complain, because it's not going to like the security situation of the encrypted page calling a non-encrypted resource. So we'll go ahead and just use that. Okay, so we got our HTTP here. That's our API path for all the other /categories and so on. And now if we go back to the menu service, we can actually use this right here. But first, we need to actually inject it. So let's go ahead and inject our API path and inject it into the function. And now we could just use the API path like so. So it's API path plus /categories.json. Okay, once we're done, we could save that. Let's go to index.html and actually import that in our scripts, and it's going to be one of the common ones. We'll copy this and we'll say, not loading, to just say menu.service.js, and we'll save that. Okay, so now we have, just to review, a constant with API path. We have the menu.service.js, which is our menu service that we've defined as a service that has a getCategories method that returns the data that is returned by these categories.json. And in fact, if I wanted to try this real quick, just to make sure I got the right URL, I'll go back to the browser, open up a new tab, and say /categories.json. And what I should get in my browser is a whole bunch of JSON. Well, not a whole bunch, but a little bit. And there it is. So that's working. So the URL is the correct URL that we're constructing in the code. Okay, so we have this, we have our menu service. The only thing that's left is to look at our resolve. It looks like the resolve that we set up is complete. So now what we have left is to actually define our menu controller. So let's go ahead and define it straight inside of our menu folder, and we'll say menu.controller.js. Again, an iffy. And then we're ready to go with use strict. And we need to define the controller on our public module. So we'll go ahead and retrieve the public module, and we'll say .controller, and we'll call the controller, we called it menu controller. We'll call the function the same way. And we'll go ahead and define the menu controller. But first, before we define it, we need to inject this menu categories that's coming from the resolve. So we'll go ahead and say menu controller $inject, and we'll inject, forgot what the name was. Let's just copy it, menu categories right here. We'll define the function of menu controller and inject the menu categories here as well. Don't need that. And here we'll just do our regular CTRL equals this, just in case we're going to need it later. But for now, we'll just say controller CTRL dot menu categories equals menu categories. So we copied it into the controller. So now menu categories is a property on the instance of the controller of the menu categories controller. So we'll save that. And if that's the case now, this menu categories controller, if we look, is bound to our menu.html. So if we go to menu.html right here, so we should be able to now output the menu categories. And in fact, let's go ahead and do that. We'll do it in kind of an ugly way, but that will work anyway. We'll just interpolate. Let's go take a look as to what our label was, menu CTRL. We'll interpret it menu CTRL dot, let's go back to the controller. It's menu categories. That menu categories, and let's go ahead and tell it that it should filter it as JSON so we can actually see it better. Let's save that. Let's go back to our browser. Let's go to this, and we see that we messed something up. Let's take a look. Oh, I misspelled service without an R. That's kind of a problem. So let's go to our index.html, and it says service. Let's save that. Go back to the browser. Could close that up, and it's not working. Let's see, why isn't that working? Let's click this. Menu controller is not A. And sometimes these URLs get messed up, so let's actually try to copy it this way and maybe open it up there. Let's see if it tells us better. Oh, menu controller is not a function and got undefined. Okay, so let's go back to our code. And besides our service right here, we might want to import the controller as well if I ever want it to work, right? So we defined it in menu/menu.controller.js. Let's save that. So now it is actually going to get loaded. Let's go back to our browser. Let's see if it's happier now. It looks like it's happier. And voila, we got all of this JSON flying in our face right here before the menu. So point is, now we're able to pass along the data from the server directly into our menu.html right here. So our menu.html is now ready to get interpolated with all this data that now passed along through the resolve using the menu service that reached out to the restaurant server and passed it along to us as a menu categories into our controller right here. And then we passed it along as a property on the controller itself. And that's how we got it right here. And at this point, we're ready to start interpolating that data and actually creating our menu page, which lists all the categories.